And we're back with Lecture 2 for the Age of Jackson. One of the most important things that happens during the Jacksonian administration and really lays a groundwork for issues to come in the future is the nullification crisis. Essentially, under the nullification crisis, we have a situation where, how do I put this? Tariffs are a very important way of raising money in an era before taxes. As we've said before, tariffs essentially are a tax on goods that are imported into a country. They are put on there to promote people buying American-made goods. They are used simply as a means of taxation paid for by those who can afford to buy goods brought in from another country. It's a major financial mechanism in the early American Republic. In 1828, Congress approves the tariff, what is called the Tariff of Abominations. Essentially, the Tariff of Abominations places incredibly high tariffs on goods imported into the United States. For the most part, people look at this and they say, well, okay, this is bad, this is a high tariff, but we can make it work it out. Who's going to pay for this? The people who are going to import or buy imported European goods, which are essentially luxury items, are going to be the ones who pay for this. Well, those people essentially are in the South. Those are the cotton planters. Southern cotton planters feel that this is a tax pointed at them. They think that it is rewarding Northerners because Northern business is based on selling goods and acting as importers, and so the shipping interests in New England are going to make money on importing goods, but ultimately Southerners will be taxed when the tariff is passed along the final price. There's also a fear that cotton is going to be affected because cotton is the number one product of the American South, and it is sold internationally. While American industry is ramping up in this period, England is the main manufacturer of cotton cloth, the first industrialized commodity in the Western world. They are buying cotton both from their colony in India as well as from the American South. It is the major economic engine of American agriculture. By 1859, cotton will be the number one export and the source of much of America's income. There's a fear by Southerners that because of the Tariff of Abominations, other nations will put high tariffs on American cotton and they'll stop buying it, which will ruin their economies. The leader of the opposition to the Tariff of Abominations is the Vice President of the United States. This is John C. Calhoun. The painting is Calhoun as Vice President. He's more famous for the black and white photograph that we have on the side with the real nice neck beard going on. Calhoun is a strict constructionist as far as the Constitution goes. He is a strict states' rights individual. He supported things like the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. He believes that the states are the primary mechanism for governmental rule and that we should have a weak federal government. And he sees the Tariff of Abominations as something that will financially harm the American South, as well as his personal pocketbook, to be honest. it is very famously on April 13th of 1830, there is going to be kind of a showdown between John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson at the Jefferson's Day Democratic feast. Normally, the Democratic Party will have a feast celebrating Thomas Jefferson's birthday. At a gathering such as this, there would be a meal, there would be orations, but there would be a round of toasts at a banquet such as this. We've kind of lost this tradition in our age, and it's kind of a shame in some way. Essentially, the the Jefferson dinner was hosted by a man named Hayne. Hayne's toast to lead the night said, "The Union of States and the sovereignty of the states." Andrew Jackson responded, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." One of Jackson's most famous quotes as president. John C. Calhoun will respond to Jackson with his own toast. "The Union, next to our liberty, the most dear." So here, essentially, Calhoun is saying that the federal government is of secondary importance to personal freedom or personal liberty or the liberty of the states. Jackson's position is that the federal government is central and must be preserved. And so this is the night where the Jackson administration is torn apart. How will we enforce the tariffs? What will happen? Ultimately, John C. Calhoun will resign as vice president, and in some very fancy political maneuvering, the senator from South Carolina will resign to become the governor, and Calhoun will be appointed to serve as senator from South Carolina, thereby giving him a greater voice to speak out against the Jackson administration and the crisis. Ultimately, Calhoun and his followers say that they can nullify any law passed by the federal government within the confines of South Carolina. South Carolina doesn't have to enforce the tariff of abominations because state law is more important than federal law. And since this tariff goes against the interests of South Carolina planters, they can vote to nullify federal law. Jackson counters with the force bill, and he actually puts up for a vote a bill to mobilize the United States Army and United States Navy to blockade Charleston Harbor and enforce the tariffs of 1828. This brings up threats of secession. South Carolina in 1832 threatens to secede. They will sever their ties with the federal union because they believe that their rights are central and more important than the power of the federal government. It comes very, very close to the use of military force. Ultimately, through all of this, through the work of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and other major American politicians from all sides, we see a compromise of 1832 passed and signed into law, which is a tariff with lower rates. It also has items in it that appeal to other sections so that it is not seen entirely as kowtowing to the whims of South Carolina. Jackson signs this into law and it ends the nullification crisis. But what's important here is that The specter of secession has been raised in America. South Carolina is not the first state to threaten to secede. They are the ones who take it most seriously and come the closest to doing it in the 1830s. And we have an exposition here of how weak and fragile the federal union actually can be. On top of the nullification crisis, we also have issues of Indian removal going on in this time as Americans expand southward and westward into the rest of the continent. Relations with tribal nations had always been tenuous at best with the various groups prior to the Jackson administration. Unfortunately, they are going to degrade even further. Jackson will challenge the rights of the tribes to maintain their own lands and territories. In one case, the Cherokee will attempt to ban individuals, especially Christian missionaries, from entering their lands because the Christian missionaries are interfering with their means of life and how they are, what they choose to do, how they choose to live. The Supreme Court will actually side with the Cherokee and say that the Cherokee have the right to autonomy on their own treaty lands, and Jackson will say Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. In other words, I have an army, I have the power of the United States Army. The Supreme Court is just a bunch of men in robes. They can't enforce anything, so I'm going to do whatever I wish. We'll see many new treaties negotiated in this period, and in 1830, the Jackson administration will sponsor and sign into law the Indian Removal Act. Essentially, what this act does is it says that the federal government, the president, has the power to exchange traditional tribal lands east of the Mississippi River and take them for U.S. government use in exchange for lands west of the Mississippi River. The government essentially has the power under the auspices of the power of the president to take away the right of lands of Native Americans as long as we give them an equivalent amount of lands in the West. This is how Jackson is going to justify Indian removal. But we also need to keep in mind that many of these, we're talking about transplanting people from one traditional environment with ways that supported their beliefs, religious systems, behaviors, etc., and transferring them to an entirely different environment, almost an entirely different world that will challenge how they know how to live. We're giving them some of the worst unclaimed lands west of the Mississippi River. And Jackson says, I have the power to do it and I can do it without being challenged, and he will not listen to anybody who chooses to stop him. One thing that's problematic about many of the 70 treaties that the Jackson administration will sign during his reign is that they are legally vague. In many cases, it appears that the Jackson administration will enter into treaties determining the fates of entire indigenous groups with people who aren't the actual representatives of these tribes. It would be like Vladimir Putin signing a treaty with me, and I claim to be the representative of the United States government. I have not been elected to diddly bubkus, and I have no ability to sign a treaty for the United States government. But Putin would come in and say, "Hey, Dr. Welch, sign this treaty. I have right to Florida." Well, it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately for the Jackson administration, it will. And the Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, will all be displaced from their traditional native lands in the American Southeast and forced to walk to Oklahoma. This is the Trail of Tears. One thing I want to say, we don't actually know how many people died on the Trail of Tears. There is a claim out there, and I spent some time researching this before I wrote this lecture, that 14,000 Native Americans died on the Trail of Tears. That number comes out decades after the Trail of Tears. The best evidence we have is that anywhere between 2,500 and 8,000 Native Americans died during these marches. We have numbers as low as 800. So we don't know. We can't accurately say because there are no actual extant records that tell us how many people died. But even the Trail of Tears is not a period term. It was Indian removal. That's a petty point. It's just something I wanted to address, the confusion over the number of deaths. People did die on the Trail of Tears. But if you look at this is the illegal removal of Native Americans from their traditional homelands to fuel American expansion. A lot of the lands in northern Georgia and eastern Alabama are actually going to be subject to one of the first American gold rushes. These are actually, especially North Georgia, that area on the map that is occupied by the Cherokee in northern Georgia and taken from them in 1835 is some of the roughest, least acceptable agricultural land in the state of Georgia. It is rocky, it is mountainous, it is not good land. And it is seized because there has been gold found in northern Georgia and there is a gold rush there. The lands in Mississippi from the Choctaw and the Chickasaw will actually become the core of the Black Belt, the Cotton Belt, and Western migration and expansion of Southern cotton-based agriculture. Even in 1832, we have the Black Hawk War in Illinois and eastern Iowa, a fight with the Sac and Fox over the intrusion of white people into traditional Sac and Fox tribal lands. And after they lose this war, they will be forced to leave for the American West as well. We have another war in this period. We got the Bank War, we got the Spoils War, we have the Indian Wars. The Bank War is essentially a political fight over the nature of American economic policy and currency. The Bank of the United States had not been explicitly described and written out in the Constitution. And so ever since the Washington administration, there has been a dispute over whether or not the United States actually had the right to establish a state bank in order to help with monetary policy. Ultimately, under the work of Alexander Hamilton and others, we will see the expansion of a state bank, the first bank of the United States. It will expire in 1822 to help the financial recovery following the War of 1812. We'll see the second Bank of the United States chartered. And essentially, it's meant to store government funds to make sure that we have, this is the money for the United States is actually going to physically be kept somewhere as a deposit, earning interest rather than just being a theoretical construct. It is meant to control the stability and currency of the American monetary system. And it's also meant as a mechanism for issuing credit to businesses and other banks. If you wanted to get a loan, you actually got a loan from one of these larger banks, not your local bank. The problem here is that Andrew Jackson hates the banks. Andrew Jackson has witnessed bank failures, especially in 1819. He sees these bank failures as threats to Americans, and especially the average Americans. Only rich people have money to store in banks. The average person, the average farmer, doesn't have enough money to actually keep in banks. We also have the influence of foreign governments over American politics and American monetary policy because they are depositing money in American banks to gain interest. They're also issuing American banks credit. And so Jackson, on basically every possible level, thinks that banks are horrid. There should be no banks. We're going to have gold coins. And we don't need to stabilize our economy through the creation and operation of a state bank. The Bank of the United States is supposed to be rechartered every 10 years. So in 1832, we have the beginning of a fight over, or pardon me, in 1832 we begin the fight over the charter of the bank. The charter is supposed to be renewed in 1836, and Andrew Jackson will refuse to renew, and the Democrats as well will refuse to consider renewing the Charter of the United States. They say this as early as 1832. They actually they're unable to remove all of their deposits at first immediately from the Second Bank of the United States. But what they do is they establish, or they go to a series of Democratic Party friendly banks, and they start putting their deposits in those Democratic banks and not in the official state bank. And eventually, as time goes by, the deposits in the national bank are expended, they disappear, the money has been placed in other banks, and when the time to charter the bank comes about and it is not renewed, we have the de facto end of the Second Bank of the United States as a means of acting as an economic policy engine, and everything that goes hand in hand with that. What it's going to do is the process of destabilizing the Second Bank of the United States is going to destabilize American monetary policy. It's going to destabilize the currency, and we're going to see the rise of a major economic depression in the Panic of 1837, which takes place the next year. And so for the next few years, America will be in an economic depression that in many ways has its roots in the bank war. Before we go, we also have to kind of go back and recognize that Andrew Jackson was a badass on every level. Besides being a battlefield general, besides being a man who defeated the British through an alliance with pirates, he survives the first assassination attempt against an American president. In January of 1835, Richard Lawrence, a man who by most accounts was mentally ill, attempts to assassinate Jackson on the steps of the United States Capitol. A member of Congress had died, and Jackson was attending the funeral, which was held in the Capitol building. As Jackson left the Capitol to exit, Lawrence steps out from behind a pillar with a pair of pistols, and the pistols misfire. They are leveled at Jackson's chest. By all rights, he should be dead. He's a famous duelist. He already has a bullet in his chest to begin with. He's already killed a man in a duel, and Lawrence steps out from behind a pillar trying to finish the job, and Jackson will mercilessly beat Lawrence with his cane. The president will subdue his own would-be assassin on the steps of the Capitol until other people can step in and wrestle Lawrence to the ground. Lawrence will actually be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and he will spend the rest of his life in a mental asylum, dying in 1861 because of his act. But again, it's a great story about how Jackson is just this powerhouse of a man, even in his old age, able to defend himself as he sees fit. All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up there. When we come back, we'll wrap up the week talking about the expansion of slavery and its role in the American Republic. Have a great day.